Good morning, family. Hello, hello, hello. I hope today finds everyone well. Today is Tuesday, June 2nd, 2020, and I am your host, Kurt Romer. How's everyone today? I have to tell you, I'm completely miffed at just political things today. I'm not going to talk about it. Just know that, well, you know me, guys. So today, a reading from our CDX Automotive book in our glossary. We're currently still on pages 1178, 11. Oh no, we're up into 1179 now. We're going to talk about air spring, air supply system, air switching valve. Well, you know what? And we'll leave air conditioning for tomorrow. The compressor clutch. Yeah, that deserves its own video. So today, air supply system, air spring, air switching valve. Today's lecture. All right. It's a little dark in here, huh? That's all right. I have my glasses. I can get this done. There you guys are. I can see you now. Air spring, a part that provides the springing action or auxiliary spring. It is typically used on air suspension systems or heavy truck applications. This is true. Wherein, so 18 wheelers have a vacuum and compressed air system. The vacuum brakes hold the brakes open. And then they also have an air supply system, which works in tandem with their air suspension. And an air spring is nothing more than a bladder held, a rubber bladder held within a metal container that's valve, like it looks like a shock absorber from the outside, but instead of having fluid inside, it's got a rubber bladder, and you can inject air into it to make it stand up, or you can take air out of it to make it drop down. And when you have just a low amount of psi, as you compress it, it reads the buildup in pressure and it adds air to it to make it stand back up again. And when it's stood back up and there's no more pressure pushing down, it takes the air out, acts like a spring, which is different than the airbags that hold at a consistent pressure, um, that dampen out the springing effect. So that's an air spring. Um, Not going to talk a lot about it a lot because that's a lot of truck stuff. Air supply system, equipment in a motor vehicle that delivers air to the engine. Okay, you can do this one of two ways. That can be either an intake manifold, supplies air, or a lot of times what they might be referring to is the smog pump. Now, a smog pump also does two things. A smog pump provides vacuum and pulls exhaust gases out of the exhaust line and refeeds it into the intake manifold for reburning. So a portion of the exhaust gases, especially at like idle or off idle, get rerouted again and reburned, and hopefully it lowers. It was a very 70s and 80s way to handle emissions. Smog pumps are no longer really used a lot. Some companies I still think try to use the smog pump. You get a lot of diesel applications where, not diesel, excuse me. No, diesel have smog pumps and check valves and air recirc valves. All that stuff reminds me of like Volkswagen diesel engines. They're the ones that run the air check valve and smog pump systems. Volkswagen TDI. They're also the ones. That's the company that got in trouble because they were falsifying all their data. Everybody lies. All right, air switching valve. Oh, the valve used to switch secondary air from near the exhaust valve, which is upstream, to the catalytic converter downstream for the purpose of oxidizing hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide. So, an air switching valve, we were just talking about the TDI and all that, and on some gas motors, when there is an abundance of unburned fuel in the exhaust path, a great idea is to introduce fresh air near as near to the exhaust valve as you can. What this does is it lights off, it reintroduces a fresh amount of air, kind of like a compression charge of fresh air mixed with fuel. Well, now all the unburned fuel is in the hot exhaust path, and if you add a little bit of air, fresh air to it, you will get a scenario in which fresh air mixed with hot exhaust gases mixed with fuel will react at the catalytic converter more efficiently. So, and that's for the purpose of oxidizing or burning hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide after the compression and ignition event in the cylinder in the exhaust side. So hot exhaust gases and unburned fuel are pushed out of the cylinder into the exhaust manifold, and fresh air is introduced at that location to mix with both the unburned fuel and the exhaust gases, so that unburned fuel is either reignited in the exhaust manifold in a slow burn. It's not a compressed ignition. It's just like lighting a bowl of gas on fire. You get a little flame. It's not great. And that added heat, and believe me, exhaust gases are still being pushed down. So these little flame fronts that occur in the exhaust path, when they get to the catalytic converter, when we cut them open, I can't wait to cut open a cat for you guys. It looks like a little honeycomb, like a bee's hive honeycomb, except smaller. So air has to go through these small little hexagonal corridors. And the hexagons themselves are made of rhodium, cadmium, titanium, I forget one other metal. There's a couple more metal in these alloys. And what happens is unburned fuel combined with hot exhaust gases and the residual flame front of fresh air coming in causes the catalytic converters to get really hot, and hot catalytic converters react with the unburned fuel and the exhaust gases, and they catalyze. And that's another word we'll discuss later, not today. Just know that it's coming up. And they catalyze these unburned fuels and these exhaust gases, and they break them down. So it breaks the chemical bonds of your exhaust gases and the unburned fuel and fresh air down, so that only nitrogen, oxygen, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide are ejected out of the back of a tailpipe. And those levels of those various gases are strictly handled by not only the manufacturers, but by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. You have to, all of your fleet of cars have to not only get a certain gas mileage, but your fleet of cars has to operate within a acceptable exhaust limit. You can't pass, if it's over the limit, the car fails, and it fails emissions. You don't want to fail emissions. Now, a lot of things can go into making your car fail emissions. A clogged smog system, like a recirc valve's not working, or it's an older car. Most new cars, like a 2018, 2019, they're super efficient. They're using direct injection so that every little last bit of fuel is mixed with a proper amount of air, and it gets ignited in the combustion process. There is no unburned fuel. It's just exhaust gases. And the catalytic converters operate even better when there's no fuel involved for them to having to catalyze. Catalytic converters catalyzing only exhaust gases. No unburned fuel, no excess air, just exhaust gases work really, really well at catalyzing those exhaust gases and breaking them down into nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and I'm thinking one or two other things that they make. And though you don't want to be breathing it in, it's not as harmful as a lot of the smog and the pollutants and the soot that can come out of a misfiring, poorly running engine. Um, I'll have to reread those chapters myself just to tighten up my knowledge of gas, catalyzing gases in the exhaust pathway, and what actual gases are coming out. But that'll be for me for later. For you, just know that the air switching valve switches air from being injected near the exhaust valve all the way down towards near the catalytic converter, where they want to introduce that amount of air. And yeah, you might want to introduce that amount of air near the exhaust valve to get a burn going in the exhaust manifold, not even in the engine, outside of the engine, igniting that air fuel mixture, that unburned fuel mixture in the exhaust pathway to help heat up your catalytic converter. Again, another notorious car that really had hot exhaust was rotaries, the Mazda RX-7, because it was a notoriously wet engine where unburned fuel was completely normal in the exhaust area. So much so that, one of the first cars, those things backfire and they brap and they flame pop all the time because so much fuel. They always run a smidge on the rich side. Matter of fact, sometimes more than a smidge on the rich side. Because remember, one signal pre-ignition event will total a rotary motor. It just breaks the apex seals, snaps them, burns them, and now you've got no compression, zero. So, yeah, that. Okay, next item. Air switching valve. Got that done? Oh, I done them because the next one's air conditioning compressor clutch. I'll talk about air conditioning tomorrow. So we'll stay on the air switching valve, air supply system, equipment in a motor vehicle that delivers air to the engine. I laugh because to me that just says intake manifold, or turbocharger, supercharger, delivering air to the engine. The only other thing that I can think of is the close the book. Oh, I hope I didn't just. There we go. Woo! The window went away for a minute. I thought I had stopped the video. So let me give you a little bit of background. During the 50s and the 60s, All right, let me even dial it back further. 19, let's go 1909, 1910, 1911. Henry Ford has come out with a Tin Lizzie, Model A Ford, a bucket seated, one wheel drive, four tires on the ground, 2-speed automobile. The fun thing about that car was it had 3 pedals, but the pedal on the left wasn't a clutch. I think it was a reverser gear. So if you wanted to go in reverse, you had to stomp down on that third pedal. The throttle was on the floor, but your choke was on a stalk. So you could choke like if you were starting the motor, you needed to put the choke on, you would pull this. It was really convoluted. I have to really go back and look at a couple of old Ford films to remind myself, but I do remember, I think there are 3 pedals on the ground, and the one on the left wasn't the clutch. It was either a reverser or it was the brakes. Wait, there might have been the brake on the left and the reverser in the middle that you would have to push and hold down and then apply throttle and choke, and then engage the clutch. It was a mess to drive. It wasn't easy at all. But once you got going, it was okay because you had like 2 gears. That's it. And high low. That's all. High low. In order to start it, you had to go up front and prime the Energizer spring. So it showed you winding that bar up. It looked like almost like you were trying to use an old socket bar in order to twist off a bolt on the front. You weren't. What you were doing is you were slowly developing spring tension in this mainspring that was housed on the front on the crankshaft. And when it got to a certain tension and you got to that tension point, the spring would kick over the motor, which was really, really interesting, which is why you see people at the front winding up the cars. You're winding up a clock spring, which when it got to a certain tension point, spun over the motor. You weren't spinning over the motor with this. You're not going fast enough. You needed to, it was a small beveled gear set, and that gear set slowly wound up the windings, the winding spring. It's like a clock spring. It goes around and around. And that would eventually turn the motor over and that car would start. Years later, Cadillac came out with the electric starter. We just pushed a button. So interestingly enough, it didn't have a battery. The Model T didn't have a battery, but it did have a series of coils. Now, since the first Model T engine was a 4-cylinder, in the actual sitting compartment where it was dry, because sometimes the engines were exposed, it just had a little lid on the top. Rain would get in, and there wasn't a lot of electrical wire, and the electrical wire back then didn't have plastic covering it. It had plaster or cloth that they would wind about the copper wire, and it was this cloth, this burlappy cloth, that provided insulation so you didn't get 2 wires touching each other, which they did all the time. Okay, so keeping the wires separate was a big thing. You could easily have a car fire. There are they went up. These electrical systems went up. So, anyways, the coils were located in the cab on the dashboard in between the driver and the passenger. And these coils were contact point coils, which means at a certain point, enough electrical charge developed in a coil to collapse a magnetic field, closing the armature, and the electricity would run through the armature, run down this very these spark plug wires that were wrapped in cloth and rubber, right? Early rubber is not the rubber that we have now. Early rubber is like right boiled off the rubber tree. It was soft, but it cracked within a season. Like you get one season out of it. That's it. You have to get new rubber wrapped wires because they would crack and develop gaps and stuff. It's crazy. Well, it's also the beginning of the automobile, So the condenser would collapse and the electricity would flow down the wire, down to the spark plug, and it wouldn't be a smack. It would it would have the condenser points would collapse and the electricity would literally ignite the spark plug, and it wouldn't be a bright brap. It would be a low key and it would hum for a bit, and you'd have the ignition event within the cylinder, and the car would run. And not a lot of RPM. I mean, like literally, I think these things topped out at 2,000 RPM, idled at 600, topped out all in 2,000 RPM or some silly number like that. But these coils, these condenser coil packs that were on the dashboard of the Model T, the early Fords, they had a wood box case, right? Wood box case. And the armature, the thing that went up and down when there was enough charge, the magnetic field collapses, causing the arm to come down and completing the electrical circuit until the electricity was depleted in the coil, and then it would allow the spring to pull the armature away. And now you had an air gap, right? A big air gap, and the electricity would stop blowing, and that spark plug would not have electricity. You would be driving down the road, right? And the coil packs, which were exposed and in a metal bracket, these 4 wood box coil packs, you would watch the contactors, the little contact points and the armatures would be sparking right there on the dashboard. And you didn't want to touch them because they'd give you a wake up pop, right? They'd make you pop. And some of them, they work to this day. That's how real basic electrical and electronic these things are. They still work to this day. I'm going to have to do some research to get the exact series of events right down for Model T Fords, but I'm pretty sure I'm pretty close. My memory serves me well, and I remember seeing a couple of these, not only at Barrett-Jackson Auto, but had a friend of mine that was had one and worked on one, which confused the heck out of me. I was younger. I think I was 19 or 20, and he had a Model T. He had a Tin Lizzie, and it was a hoot. And he would take it. Oh, I remember he took it in the parade. I sat in that thing for one parade. I went down the parade with him. My dad sat up front with him, and I sat in the back. And we did a St. Patrick's Day parade in New Haven. And it must have been like 1977 or 78 or something. I guess I wasn't in my 20s. I was younger. Wow. My memory. Woof. It had to be when I was younger. I was born in 68, so 78 makes me 10. So it was 10 years old when this guy was showing me the car and everything. And that the different pedals and stuff and all those the coils on the dashboard. Wow. Cool. So anyways, so that's the start of cars. Then in the 1920s and the 1930s, cars got bigger. The engines got bigger. They used better carburetors. Spark plugs became more robust. The wiring became more robust. The cars carried lots more steel. And by the time you got to the the late 1930s, 1937, 38, 39. The United States was now entering into World War II. And so piston engine development, motivated by its wartime necessities, engineers and scientists all aimed their intellect at making better airplanes, better tanks, better jeeps, better equipment for the troops in preparation for America's introduction into World War II. I know that there was in the late 1930s. I know we haven't gotten into the war yet. The war started for us in late 1941, 1942. Well, that's when America really got dragged in, because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in a preemptive strike designed to take our Navy out of the equation. What Admiral Yamamoto didn't realize that was, in doing so, he may have crippled 3/4 of our Western theater large battleship group, but that we had an amazing ability in our nation at the time of turning our production output. You got to remember, the United States back in the day, we were secessionists. We didn't want to deal with the outside world. We just wanted to do our own thing. And we created amazing, when I mean amazing, I mean amazing feats of construction. We had entire industries devoted to manufacturing, steel development, electronics development. I am not taking away from the social issues that we had in the late 1930s, early 40s. It was horrible there. We're not talking about that right here. But I am talking about how, as an animal itself, as an organism itself, the American production system, all of the various privately owned companies and a couple of the government owned companies, when the government said, we're going to war, and we mean it, we need you to start building tanks, and we need you to start building airplanes, we need you to start building guns, all of the companies built something. It's really interesting to see in World War II in 1940 and 41, and later into 42 and 43, tanks were made by Chrysler. Ford made half tracks. Those are those trucks that have the army men in the back, and they've got the back side has the tank tracks and the front had the tires. Ford made those. Ford manufactured, in conjunction with Allison engines, they made the V12 Allison engine that they put forth in the Spitfire. No, in the Mustang, P-51 Mustang. And who else? Some other big company, I think Chevrolet at some point, created the gearboxes that were in the Corsairs. The engines were still manufactured by Lycoming, which is their aeronautical. What other things? Automotive, car companies. I mean, it was amazing that all of these industries that had to do in automotive turned around. They started making military stuff. And there were a lot of people in America. And believe me, one of the things that Admiral Yamamoto failed to realize is that he thought America was much more agricultural, farms, and it was. We had lots of farms, but we also had these major cities of industry. And he, I think it was within 2 days of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he recognized that he had awoken a sleeping giant, I think was the term that he used when he spoke to the emperor about whether or not Pearl Harbor was a success. And it turned out not to be. America got pissed off, woke up, and went to what we call war footing, in which every single company, I mean, it got so intense that there was scrap metal drives. What is that? You don't drive around with scrap metal. No, not that kind of a drive. A company, a part of the USO, I think it was. The USO was a group of individuals. They provided comedy relief for troops overseas. They had the dancing, the ladies in their dresses like Las Vegas in the line, and they're all dun 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 dun. Dun. Yeah, that. They would send those ladies over to provide dancing and to show them a bit of home. Singers would go over, and these were all people that were part of the USO, which was a group used to help the military and help the troops. And one of the things I think that the USO did is they did metal drives where they would go house to house and go, do you have any scrap metal to donate to the war effort? And people were giving over steel skillets, coffee makers, the legs off of their coffee and kitchen tables. If it was made of metal, they would donate it, especially stuff like aluminum. Aluminum was used in the airframes of these airplanes that were manufactured at car plants. They stopped making cars and just started, designers would come in, and in 2 weeks they'd go, okay, we're no longer making the Edsel. Push the Edsel aside. We'll get to it when we come back to it. Everything, just push it over to the side. Okay, we need to make the left wing of a P-51 fighter. This is the design. This is the parameters. Make it. And so they would take the tooling and they go, okay, well, there's a spar and there's some internal ribbing, and okay, production line P-51 left wing. Have at it. And so they go over to the next line where, so the Edsel bodies got moved over, and it says, oh, we're in the engine area now. Okay, well, you were making V8s. Now you're making V12s. Tool up. What bore and stroke do you got? 3.5 by 3.5. All right, Allison V12 is a 4x4. 4-inch diameter piston, 4-inch stroke. So tool up for that. And we're going to start getting castings in, and these castings are for V12s. Can you handle it? We can handle it. And so boom, Ford was now, they were making engines. So the automotive community in the early 40s was put to a wartime footing, and these car companies were making military parts. Chrysler genuinely made tanks. Chrysler was a heck of a company back in the day. Chevy was tiny, Ford was big, Chrysler was big. Chrysler, they were like, oh, you guys making big car, you're going to make big tanks. They're good tanks made by Chrysler. And they were like just pure production. They didn't care if you could make 50,000 engines, but only 500 airplanes. You made the 50,000 engines because, interestingly, what they would do is they would take these airplane engine and stick them into tanks. Early tanks had airplane engines in them. Those were high horsepower engines, man. These things were serious. And then the designers went, we want to make these planes fly higher. How do we do that? So put a compressor on it. What kind of air compressor? Air compressor. Well, what type of air compressor? Roots. You want Roots style? Early Allison motors had Roots style compressors on them. Then they went to belt driven centrifugals, and after that they got into turbos. So late model P-51s had turbochargers on them. And those P-51s, their ceilings, because air gets thinner as you get higher, turbos could compress this thinner air into a thicker amount, which mimicked low altitude air, air that had 14.7 pounds per square inch. So that's all you were trying to do, was give the internal manifold 14.7 pounds at all times, so the engine would run as if it was at sea level, which was perfect. And these planes could fly well way up where there's barely any oxygen in air, because they were using turbochargers to stuff this thin air to make it to 14.7 psi. So the turbochargers that we use in our cars are directly descended from the turbos and the superchargers and the induction methods that engineers developed for our fighter pilots, for their fighter airplanes. And the interesting thing is, the designers said, okay, we've got these turbochargers, and when you wind up the engine, they develop this much pressure. And the tank guys said, well, we're never going to be up in the air, so what do turbochargers do on the ground? They said, well, it makes a heaps more power. Heaps more. So this normally aspirated V12 Allison engine that put out 500 horsepower, you mean we stick a turbo on it, we can make 1,000 horsepower? They're like, more than that. 1,200? So there you are. You have an early Sherman tank that was designed to go 22 miles an hour, and they're sticking big Allison engines in it with superchargers and turbochargers, and they're developing 1,200 horsepower. Now this little Sherman tank is not going 22 miles an hour; it's going 60. Well, not that fast, but 48 miles an hour. VTEC kicking in. And all of a sudden, the Sherman tank is now a viable weapons platform. Look at this hair going nuts. The Sherman tank is now viable. It's a viable little tank, all due to the horsepower and torque being put out by aircraft engines in the back. Modern M1A2 Abrams, guess what kind of engine they have in the back of the tank? Turbine jet engines, same as you find in an F-16. Same, at least 2 variants of the Abrams had that. I think they went back to Detroit Pistons. But there was a series of tanks that used jet engines in the back. Serious stuff. I don't know much about tanks in that regard. I'll have to do my own study on that. So, to go back to the original concept of air pumps. So here we are in the 40s. Designers are getting, now believe me, what they learned in the military, guys in the military, I'm a mechanic, I work on tanks, I know all about superchargers and turbochargers and an injection and carburation. And I know all about this because I'm a mechanic trained by the Army. The Army trained me. I went through boot camp, right? And I'm saying me in World War II. And they sent me away to Chrysler for 6 weeks. And I had a crash course because, I was a mechanic back home and we worked on our John Deeres and Caterpillars. And they're like, no, you're working on gas tank motors. Okay, right? And you learned about these high-end military pieces of hardware. And believe you me, when these guys got home after the war, they didn't forget about what they learned. And so after World War II concluded, because car production dropped to almost nil during World War II, rubber was needed for airplane tires and tank treads. Metal was needed for tank production and gun production. Aluminum was needed for airplanes and airplane production. Wood was needed for instrumentation paneling and all of the, gun stocks. All these things Everything was needed for the war. And that's one of the reasons why America won the war. We woke up our entire production infrastructure turned to making things that go boom and destroy stuff. And we also had a lot of people. So all of a sudden, we went into the war. We didn't come in like England with a limited amount of equipment and a limited amount of personnel. We flooded. We did the Crimson Roll. We rolled Europe up. We like literally. You watch the old films on World War II. Our advances were just we just crushed. We pinched Germany between us and Russia. And the Russian, they didn't have a lot of guns or tanks. You know what they did have in Russia? Lots of people. So they were just throwing bodies. There was a couple of movies. One of them was really sad. Jude Law starred in it. And basically they showed Russian troops where they gave, this is before Soviet Union. This is old Russia. This is good, right? And the Russian Tsar knew that if Germany took his country over, they were just going to get slaughtered. So if they're going to get slaughtered, they might as well do it as free Russians. So he goes, I give you rifle and 5 bullets. I give you 20 bullets. You are a rifleman. You shoot gun for 5 bullets. When you need more, you get more bullets from him. If you die, you pick up his rifle and you shoot. If you die, you reach over and grab extra ammo and carry it with you and shoot more. Oh, and you over here, number 3, you look around and make sure they don't get shot. But if you get shot, you two keep going. If these two get shot, you pick up ammo and rifle. Literally, they would send 3 or 4 people out, 1 rifle, couple of ammo, and the others would just huddle about the riflemen. Russia threw bodies. The Germans would just machine gun Russians down, and the Russians would just keep coming. Like us, but without guns. Yeah, because the Germans didn't want to fight us. Everywhere we went, we kicked butt. We had better gear. In the beginning, the Germans had better gear, no doubt. We learned quickly. The Panzer tank was superior in all manner to the original first Shermans that went over, or the first tanks that we were using. But by the end of the war, we went from the howitzer on the front of the first set of Sherman tanks was only like a 15 millimeter projectile, real small, super small, 5-inch 54 or something like that, 54 caliber, just a tiny, tiny gun. And by the end of the World War II, our tanks were rolling 105 millimeter smoothbores. Boom! Just crushing German tanks. In the beginning, Fury's a great movie. It showed how, one Russian Panzer could take out a bunch of American Shermans, because those were early Shermans. The later tanks, though, one American tank could go and just walk through a field and boom, 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 boom. But it took time to develop these sciences, these technologies, and we did. We took the time. We learned, and by the end of the war, all that ingenuity came to the automotive field, and you ended up with cars with really, plastics was starting to become a thing. So wiring now became plastic coated. They started using coatings on the wire so you'd have no more grounding outs. That's all automotive from the aeronautics fields. They wanted to make the electronics equipment. You don't want fires up at 30,000 feet in your P-51 or your Corsair, your Vought Corsair. You don't want flames licking your pilot's compartment. The only flames you want are coming out the end of your barrels, you know. So all these advances were done in the name of the war effort, and these advances trickled down into the automotive fields. And so, you know, these all of these mechanics came back, and these companies, so now GIs that had money, that had survived the war, they had disposable income, they had money in their pockets from the government, and they one of the first things they wanted to do is buy a car. So there you are in the late 40s, and we had this massive boom of people coming back wanting to buy cars. So the car companies took all the production that they used for automotive or for airplanes and tanks, they shoved that aside, they brought the cars back over, and mechanics were like, hey, I want to work. Come on in, we got plenty of openings. A lot of people want to buy cars, we got to make cars. So the productions went up. It was outstanding. I love seeing the numbers from like World War II at the end of the war, and you just watch the production numbers for cars jump. And then with the amount of cars being sold and the mechanics bringing all the trade secrets out of the military production points, and at the at the factory level themselves too, the factories were told new ways of making and new ways of production and new ways of advances in electronics and electrical systems and new engine manufacturing ways and new metallurgy for the cast iron blocks and stuff. They started making engines bigger and bigger because, 8,000 horsepower for a tank. I wonder what a couple hundred horsepower in a V8 would do for a 1950 Ford Coupe. So engines got a lot bigger. They went from 200 cubic inch to 300 cubic inch, and in the late 50s, early 60s, 400 cubic inch. In the late 60s, early 70s, almost 500 cubic inch. I think Cadillac had a 500 cubic inch engine that it had in the 70s. Granted, it was a smog monster and it only made like 80 horsepower, but it had all the torque in the world. But believe me, back in the 40s, when late 40s, early 50s, when the GIs came home and they had money, not only was the automotive industry revitalized, but the design of cars was revitalized. They went from a frumpy sedan to really cool cars getting made. Like there was style choices being made, and that was really, really cool. The thing that many people weren't thinking about back then was the burning of fossil fuels and leaded gasoline. Back then, gasoline was leaded. It had a lead component to it. Lead was dissolved in the gasoline, and it acted like a lubricant. It's really, even to this day, if you had leaded gasoline and you ran it, your engine would run really good because it at a molecular level it would coat the piston as it went up and down in the cylinder, and the valves edges would be coated. Man, it would be, you could tell it was a smooth running engine. But the problem was when you burned lead, if you sucked on the exhaust pipe, you'd lose intelligence points by the minute. Lead in your body is not a good thing. It attaches to brain receptors and it doesn't allow it to fire. So you literally lose brain cells. They're there, but they're gummed up with lead. And it isn't just the thinking parts. Lead also attacks and attaches itself to the parts of your brain in charge of breathing. Your stomach, like literally you can make your stomach stop working because your stomach is connected to the brain. It just doesn't sit there and do its own thing because it wants to. It's controlled by the limbic system in your brain. It's not, and your lungs breathing, like you want to breathe. Well, imagine if your brain forgot how to breathe. You just stop breathing. So lead in the body is bad. It's very bad. But people were driving more. So there was this massive amount of people buying cars, buying trucks. The factories that produced cars were running at full tilt. So they were spewing out fumes. And it was a really interesting thing. And we've forgotten this because people are a little blasé about it. But there was a point in the late 1950s, I do believe it was the late 1950s, going up into the early 1960s, when the air quality in America tanked. It fell out the bottom. So much so that they used to have, and I remember these in the early 70s, smog reports. The smog report said 80% today. It's real tough, everybody. Close your windows, use your filters. You don't want to be outside breathing this. There were so many cars that were running leaded gasoline and carbureted. These were all carbureted cars. No catalytic converters, no efficiency, just big, beefy engines spewing out exhaust from nasty gasoline, lead gasoline. And it got so bad that there was a classic set of pictures where a picture was taken on June 1st, 1949, from the RCA building in downtown Hollywood in Los Angeles. At the top of the RCA building, the one that looks like a disc. Anyways, so they took a picture of the Hollywood sign, and it was gorgeous. It was a beautiful white buildings, red roofs, beautiful streets, and there's the Hollywood sign on the green hills of Los Angeles. And then another picture was taken, like the photographer went, took that picture, then turned around and took a picture of downtown LA. And the skyline was gorgeous, right? 1950. Troops are home from the war. They want to see movies. They want to drive cars. Good to be an American. Most Americans. Social inequality was full swing. Cut to 10 years later, 1960. I think it was 68, the year I was born. Same photographer, same camera, same date. It was 15 years. It was 15 years. It was 1970. 50, 65, 70, so makes it 20. Anyways, I just remember knowing same guy, same camera, decades later then, takes a picture of the Hollywood sign. You can't see it. Turns around, aims the camera to where Los Angeles is supposed to be. You cannot see the city from the smog, from the exhaust pipes of all of the cars and all of the factories and all of the buildings and all of the everything. So much smoke. I'm not talking clouds, smoke, huge billowing amounts of smoke, was so bad that they called it smog. The smog was so bad you couldn't see LA. You couldn't see the Hollywood sign. And it was all from the burning of fossil fuels. A group of citizens got together with some visionary individuals and said, we need to measure what's in the air. What is this smog? And so they did some tests and they found out, well, it's exhaust from all the trucks and the buses and the cars and the motorcycles and the everything. That's what this smog is. And so they said, this is no good. We're going to die. There was a massive uptick in emphysema, massive uptick in lung cancer, massive uptick in tracheal cancer, massive uptick in health and wellness issues contributed to large smog amounts. So they said, this is killing us. We need to change. So California came up with a group called the California Air Research Board, CARB. I know I'm getting the time frames wrong and the dates wrong and everything, but the idea is that it was part of the formation of the EPA, the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency, how smog wasn't just a Los Angeles thing, it was a US thing. New York, Chicago, LA, Philadelphia, Seattle, up and down the seaboard, up and down the coasts, East Coast, West Coast, in the Corpus Christi, Texas. These places were just smog, and everyone was getting sick. And so the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, came out with some rules for how much exhaust pollution could come out of an exhaust pipe. And so how would you do this? Well, they said, well, we're going to make a thing that detects the bad gases coming out of a tailpipe. And the manufacturers, Ford, Chevy, Chrysler, Dodge, all, the big ones, said, okay, we're going to figure out a way to lessen emissions. So the first thing that they did was, well, we can kind of cheat and just throw more air, fresh air in the exhaust. And so when they measure what's coming out the exhaust, the actual amount, it's still the same, but when you're measuring it with additional air, it's blending it more. And so it looks a little less. Even though it's the same amount, it looks a little less. Put it this way. Who here has ever made chocolate milk? You get a glass of milk, and you get 3 tablespoons of chocolate. Now, the chocolate is the bad stuff, right? Chocolate's the pollution. And if you put the glass of milk, which is the exhaust bath, you get 3 spoonfuls in, and you stir it, and you end up with chocolate milk. Imagine all that being smog. Well, what happens instead of having a glass of milk, we injected more milk, so you had a gallon of milk, and you had the same 3 tablespoons of pollution going in each day. You end up with milk that wasn't that cloudy. So it looks clean, but it was still the same amount of air. Or the same amount of pollution, just mixed with more injected air. And they call, all right, well, it's better numbers. And the first smog pumps were like that. They just injected air into the exhaust manifold. And then they started realizing, well, if we aim it closer to the exhaust valve and start up, all that unburned fuel burns away in the exhaust header. Well, that's good. It burns more of it, a cleaner combustion event. And people started really getting into efficiency. And believe it or not, one of the biggest catalyzers for this was Japan. Japanese innovation. So the Americans enjoyed during the 40s, 50s, and even up into the 60s. Americans were the forefront of automotive ingenuity. Man, we were unstoppable. We were just making new things and creature comforts for the driver, and it's just awesome. Well, unbeknownst to us, at this same time, Japan was also having a really good run of it. But because Japan's smaller, Americans tend to have been larger boned than Japanese counterparts. So the native peoples, the indigenous people of Japan, were of smaller stature, smaller human beings. They also didn't need their roads were smaller. In America, you had big, wide highways for trucks, right? In Japan, tiny little roads. So in Japan, the push was for small. They needed to be efficient because fuel price, that's another thing. In America, gas was cheap. Cheap. Like it's more expensive to buy milk than gas back in the day. Back in the day, a gallon of gas, even when, all right, let's take a 2020 American dollar. What does it get you now? Maybe a cheap soda, right? Using that analogy, gasoline back then, if you handed the guy $1, you could still get 3 gallons of gas. That's how cheap gas was back then. It was crazy. And like back then, it was like 8 cents a gallon. But 8 cents could get you something back then. 8 cents could get you a candy bar. You know, if you had a dime can get you a soda pop and a candy bar. So, you know, gasoline was cheap, super cheap. Price for 99 cents, like $1 a gallon of gas. $1 for a gallon of gas is cheap back then. And so you can go anywhere. You drive around all you want. Tank was always full. The Japanese, they didn't have a lot of fuel after World War II. Sanctions, restrictions, two cities wiped from the planet, like literally Hiroshima and Nagasaki, gone, just gone. And those were big infrastructure locations in production. So the major production areas of Japan were hamstrung after we bombed them. And just incredible loss of life over there. And so you started off with small little cars running small little engines. I think at one point motorcycle engines, right? They were little motorcycle engines put into little cars. And obviously, as time and ingenuity came along, the engines got a little bit bigger. Not a lot. But where in America, we had V8 Roadsters. You know, we had big V10s, and Cadillac had V16s, and there were inline 8s, right? Japan, they were all like, no, inline 4, V2, V4, inline 4, maybe an inline 6. Japan, that thing was huge. Inline 6, whoa, big engine. But the offshoot was, because they didn't have a lot of fuel, it was important to the people of Japan that they wanted to know, how many kilometers could I drive on a gallon of gas? Because I don't want to spend a lot of money on gas. It's expensive in Japan. It was 10 times the amount that what we got gas in the United States. We had refineries. We had Texas oil, Texas crude. We were bringing crude up out of Venezuela. We were buying crude from overseas in Brazil. We were buying fuel like it was going out of style. And it wasn't expensive, so we gave good price, and they shipped it. But Japan didn't have the amount of fuel that we have. So when they made a motor, they made sure, like, look, it's a 4-cylinder. It's only 1.2 liters, but this thing sips fuel. It's got a brand new carburetor on it. And in the 60s, they're like brand new fuel injectors on it. It gets really great gas mileage. Doesn't make a lot of because of its efficiency, it didn't make a lot of smog just because it was efficient. It burned its fuel air mixture very, very well. And so because of this, when the EPA said it had restrictions in the United States as to how much smog every car could put out, every car had to have an emissions test. One of the things that we were playing catch up on, we had to catch up, was that we needed to create smog purposes. Now, here's where the Americans, we were both ingenious, and we also fall on our faces every once in a while. We looked to make Band-Aids to solve a problem that was a redesign. So in the 1970s, like a 1972 Camaro, had a 350 engine in it, but it had an itty-bitty carburetor. It had a smog pump where it took exhaust gases and rerouted it back through the intake, had a second shot at burning it. The compression ratios were low, so they were always chasing their tails. The smog systems there were tubes and hoses routed everywhere. There's just, you pop the hood on a 1970 Chevrolet, and it's all smog related EGR, exhaust gas recirculating systems, tubes and hoses and wires, and new systems and used to combat pollution. All of these things came up because they thought that if they just tweaked it a little bit and just ran it a certain way, the emissions would get better. And they did. They lowered the horsepower ratings of all the cars because they thought that by taking compression away, they would increase the fuel efficiency and lower the smog. They messed with timing, so it was a more complete burn but less power because they started the burn earlier. So a lot of early cars knocked. If you got bad gas, that car knocked like crazy because they dialed out of the power band into efficiency, into emissions efficiency, not engine efficiency for that particular car. They would add air wherever they could to try to beat the sniffers in the tailpipe. The oxygen sensors became a thing. Catalytic converters were added. These were all, and Japanese cars, oh no, they were having a good time. Japanese cars were efficient. They got great gas mileage. And then they had the whole OPEC oil crisis in the 70s where gasoline prices skyrocketed. Like, whew, right? And so you had gas. So if your last number was even on your license plate, or if your letter on the back of your license plate was A through M, you could get gas on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays. If your car ended on an odd number or the letters N through Z, you could get gas on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. We had a gas crunch. We had so little fuel coming into the United States. And you had a 10-gallon limit or something like that, right? You could only get 10 gallons. So people were rolling in with their 1969 Coupe de Ville pig of a car. Yeah, pretty, but it was an 8-ton steel and lead barge with a 500 cubic inch engine that could barely propel the car with a 30-gallon gas tank. And they're like, sorry, you only get 10 gallons. The guy's like, that'll just barely make it so I drive back home. Mm-hmm. And the guy went, well, screw this. Looked around, and what was being offered? Toyota, Honda. Well, Japanese cars, but they're made well. They get tremendous gas mileage, and they're emissions friendly. Well, I'm not going to buy a Cadillac anymore. I'm going to get a Toyota. And so there was this huge, huge movement over from purchasing American to purchasing Japanese. And there was a big influx of money, and the Japanese started making their innovations with the influx of American capital and money. And they actually, in the late 80s, early 90s, they were making the best cars on the planet. You couldn't touch a Toyota. What was the most boring job on the planet? Toyota automotive technician. You didn't do anything. Those cars ran forever. Still do. They still do. One of the, there's Lexuses and there's Toyotas, Million Mile Club. So one of the things that we tried to trick and use, and there were smog pumps. Pump fresh air into the exhaust, pull air from the exhaust and push it back up through the intakes. All ways of trying to game and trick the combustion cycle into making its exhaust cleaner. Most of it's useless. You do a resto mod on a 1972. The first thing you do is you gank all the smog crap. You pull it off the engine, and you remove the carburetor. Horrible, horrible way of metering fuel. And you put it on fuel injection, and you put a catalytic converter on it, and you put wideband O2 sensors on it, and boom, Bob's your uncle. It's done. The car becomes efficient. You change the crank in it. You go with a higher compression crank. You get a more complete burn, higher temp burn, better combustion process, better fuel, less smog, less exhaust. Oh, and interestingly enough, the same guy, same camera, same location, same picture in 1980 or maybe 90, he took a picture again, and it then more closely resembled the same picture of the Hollywood sign in downtown LA. You guys can look all this up. You can Google smog and the Hollywood picture, and I'm sure it'll bring up articles of the photographer and the camera he used and the different pictures on the timeline where smog was the problem in the United States when the EPA stepped in and created all these rules about emissions for cars. Now, a lot of people would say, oh, that was the golden age of cars right before the EPA. You know, cars were making power. No, they weren't. No, they weren't. I know it's over an hour, but I just have to say this. People who lament, like, man, big block Chevy would smoke that little Japanese roadster of yours. You know it wouldn't. People love to talk about how much horsepower Chevy 454 big blocks from the day made. The truth is they didn't. They didn't make horsepower. They made some torque, some download torque for sure. But those things ran out of breath at around 4,200 RPM. My dad's 455 Super Duties made ungodly gobs amount of torque down low, but fell on its face near 4,000 RPM. Fell on its face. Had nothing left. As a matter of fact, you were looking for better gearing. That was the game to keep the Pontiac Firebird relevant in quarter mile racing. It wasn't in speed. You know, I'd hit the traps at like 135, 138. I don't remember what my 60-foot times were. My halves, they weren't great. They were good. They weren't great. I had good reaction time, but the car got out of the hole pretty good, consistent. The car made its 10-second passes based on the middle of the strip, not the end of the strip. I didn't make it out of the hole, although the launches were good. They weren't great. My 60s were okay. They weren't impressive. I don't even remember what they were. I just know that they weren't great. It was what it was. Small tire on a fat car. And once I got traction out of the hole, you could put the motor down and make the torque work for you and make the 3 speeds that I had work for me, my 3 gears in the automatic. And all that down low grunt would propel the car to 10-2 and race in that bracket. Believe you me, Dad was at the end of what that motor could put out prior to like major modifications. You know, we were scratching the edges of what we can eke out from that motor being as stock blocky and as pure as possible. You know, I'm sure we could have broke into the 9s with a set of turbos, but there you go, throwing $20,000 at the car. Then we'd have to upgrade the drivetrain, and we have to upgrade the tires. You know, and it was a process that my dad didn't want to go through. So that if we had a purebred Pontiac Firebird with a stock motor crossing 10-2 with all the tricks of the 1980s, I guarantee you cannot give me a Chevy, a Firebird, a Camaro, a Dodge Charger. All of these cars, they're too big, they're too heavy, and the engines are anachronisms. They're not designed for high horsepower applications. We've got to massage them into making those big power. You know what makes big power? 2JZ makes ungodly power. Inline 6. It's lighter, revs higher, better gearing, better power production. The torque doesn't hit so hard. It's easier on the drivetrain, even though the drivetrain's strong. You know, it's just a faster car all around. You put someone in a modern stock Supra would destroy a stock anything from the 60s, would literally bend it over backwards and throw it out with the trash. Old school cars, they're pretty, they sound glorious. They were slow AF. Just like driving a piano. Just horrible compared to modern cars, modern suspensions, modern tires, modern steering systems. You know, the slop. Oh. Funny story, and then I'll stop the video. So I'm making like my third pass at Englishtown. I'm in my dad's Pontiac. I'm in the black car, not the blue one. I'm coming up. I just come out of the water box, and I just done my burnout. Tires are warm, and I have to line my car up to get it aimed perfectly down the quarter. I kid you not, I have to almost turn, like literally, well, more like a little more than half a turn, almost into the 3/4 turn, just to make the tires move a little so I can get my car. I'm still turning the steering wheel left and right to line it up. My dad's going this way, come here, all right, lights, and I'm pointing over, and I see the lights, and I would move forward and move forward and move forward, move forward, and the bottom light would come up. That means I'm lined up, and I'd set my trans brake on, and I'd sit there for a minute, and I'd wait for the staging light to come on, and I'd rev my motor, and then I'd watch the green lights go ding, 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 donk, and then I would, off I'd go. The steering was so sloppy, it made going down the 1/4 mile strip, and it's one of the reasons why my dad didn't do it. He's older. He's like, I can't move my hands that quick. But keeping that thing steering down the center of the lane was half the battle of that car. And never mind brakes at the end. Oh my God. Braking that car was, I had to downshift. I had to do everything to bring that beastie down from speeds. And we're only talking 130, 135, 138 tops, let's say 140 all in. That Pontiac was a beastie to bring back to speed. It was terrifying. I needed all the room. Now, someone says, oh, Pontiac will smack that Japanese car you have around. No, it won't. Never would, never did, never will. High five, everybody. Thanks for listening to today's lecture.